A 7-year-old boy was sent home for nibbling a Pop-Tart into a gun. That's a real thing that happened. Prager used 2014 video War on Boys presented by Christina Hoff Sommers of the American Enterprise Institute opens with this story to make an argument about the state of boys' education in America.
Josh, like many other boys punished for violating zero-tolerance policies, was guilty of nothing more than being a typical 7-year-old boy.
And honestly, it's a pretty good opening. It's memorable. It's a little absurd. It makes you feel something. And that feeling is exactly what I want to talk about today. Because here's the thing. I'm not here to tell you boys don't have real problems in school. Some of them do. I'm also not going to do the thing where I go through the video line by line and say actually 100 times. What I want to do is look at how this video works, what it's doing to you while you're watching it, what it wants you to feel and believe, and who it wants you to blame. Because the gap between what the evidence shows and what this video tells you about the evidence is kind of remarkable. What does the video actually say? Let me walk you through the PragerU video properly, because to debunk something you have to actually understand it first. The video opens with presenter Christina Hoff Sommers making a broad claim. Quote, "Being a normal boy is a serious liability in today's classroom," end quote. She says boys are disorganized and restless, that schools have little patience for boyishness, and quotes psychologist Michael Thompson saying, quote, "Girl behavior is the gold standard in schools. Boys are treated like defective girls," end quote. From there, the video makes 4 specific reform proposals, which Sommers presents as solutions to a boy crisis in education. Let me go through each one, because this is where the actual claims live. Claim 1. Boys are failing readers, so schools need boy-friendly books. The video states in all age groups across all ethnic lines, boys score lower than girls on national reading tests. It then cites a UK study claiming girls prefer fiction and poetry, while boys prefer comics and nonfiction, concluding schools need to swap in more boy-friendly reading materials. Sommers even plugs a specific website, guysread.com, as a resource. This one is partially true. According to data from the National Center for Education Statistics, girls do consistently outperform boys in reading at virtually every grade level. And this gap has been documented since the 1970s. So the underlying fact is real. The problem is the explanation. Saying the solution is simply better books for boys treats a complex, multi-casual gap as if it were just a catalog problem. It ignores that the reading gap is smallest in wealthy, high-resource districts and largest in low-income, high-poverty ones, which we'll come back to. Claim 2. Schools punish boys' natural imagination. Here, the video tells us about a writing instructor named Ralph Fletcher, who argues that teachers prize confessional poet-style personnel narratives, the kind girls write, while action stories and adventure content are not prized. Sommers then describes a 3rd grader named Justin who got called to the principal's office because his teacher was alarmed by a drawing of a sword fight with decapitated heads. The father, the video says, was astonished by the teacher's female-centered reaction. Notice what's happening here? One anecdote, one story about one teacher and one kid in Southern California is being used to characterize the entire cultural orientation of American classrooms. The video doesn't cite any data showing that action-oriented writing is systematically penalized across schools. It tells you a story and lets you generalize. Claim 3. Zero-tolerance policies are targeting normal boy behavior. This is where the video gets specific. It states, boys are nearly 5 times more likely to be expelled from preschool than girls. In grades K to 12, boys account for nearly 70% of suspensions, often for minor acts of insubordination and sometimes for entirely innocent behavior. Then comes the Pop-Tart story. Josh Welch, age 7, sent home from Maryland school for chewing a strawberry pastry into the shape of a gun. The video calls this typical and implies it represents a systematic war on normal boyhood. Here's what's real and what's misleading about this. The expulsion statistics are roughly accurate. Research by Yale's Walter Gilliam found that preschool boys are expelled at a rate about 4.5 times higher than girls. Boys do account for disproportionate share of K to 12 suspensions. These numbers are real. But, and this is crucial, the discipline data tells a completely different story than the one PragerU wants to tell. According to federal data from the Department of Education, Black students made about 15% of K-12 enrollment but received more than 30% of all suspensions and expulsions. In 2013 to 2014, Black students were roughly 4 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension than white students. Multiple studies have confirmed that this disparity is not explained by differences in behavior, meaning Black children are not behaving worse. They are being punished more harshly for the same behaviors. A decomposition analysis published in a peer-reviewed journal found that about 46% of the Black-white suspension gap is explained by differential treatment by teachers and administrators, not by student behavior. The kids most caught in the zero-tolerance machinery aren't primarily energetic suburban white boys with Pop-Tarts. They are disproportionately Black and brown students, often in under-resourced schools. Claim 4. Schools need to bring back recess. The video's final reform proposal is bringing back recess. It cites a Science Daily summary claiming that since the 1970s, school children have lost close to 50% of their unstructured outdoor playtime. It argues that games like dodgeball and tag have been eliminated, too damaging to self-esteem or too violent, being the excuses, and suggests schools have replaced tug of war with something called tug of peace. Here's the thing. The research on recess is actually solid, and the recommendation is genuinely good. The American Academy of Pediatrics has stated that recess is a crucial and necessary component of a child development and should not be withheld for punitive or academic reasons. Studies confirm that children who get regular recess show better classroom behavior, improved attention, and stronger social-emotional skills. Since 2001, average weekly recess time in U.S. schools has declined significantly, driven largely by the pressure of No Child Left Behind era standardized testing requirements. But here's the irony. The schools with the least recess are not feeling-centered progressive schools, worried about dodgeball damaging self-esteem. Research from California found that schools with higher proportions of low-income students were dramatically less likely to provide adequate daily recess, a 90% lower odds of providing more than 20 minutes daily compared to lower poverty schools. In other words, the kids getting the least recess are disproportionately poor kids, disproportionately kids of color. Not because their schools have embraced a feelings-centered philosophy, but because those schools have faced the most testing pressure and the fewest resources. The explanation doesn't fit the data. The video makes basically 3 large claims. Boys are falling behind. This is happening because schools have become too feeling-centered and anti-competitive, and the fix is to redesign schools around boys' natural tendencies. Claim 1 is real. Parts of Claim 3 aren't unreasonable. The problem is Claim 2, the casual explanation. If feeling-centered, competition-free classrooms were really the driver of the gender gap, you'd expect that gap to be distributed pretty evenly across the country. Schools broadly adopt similar curricula, so if classroom culture were the cause, the effect should show up more or less everywhere. But that's not what the data shows. Research by LaJoie and Dupreet, published in the American Sociological Review, found that the gender gap in educational achievement is substantially larger in low-income and minority communities. When you control for socioeconomic background, the boy-girl graduation gap shrinks significantly. Stanford researcher Sean Reardon studied gender achievement gaps across more than 10,000 U.S. school districts and found something striking. In affluent, highly educated, predominantly white districts, boys actually outperform girls in math. In poorer, more racially diverse districts, girls often outperform boys in math. The direction of the gap flips depending on wealth and race. So why would feeling-centered classrooms hit poor Black and Latino boys the hardest? Are those schools more feeling-centered than wealthy suburban ones? Are they more anti-competitive? Of course not. More straightforward reading of the evidence is that the gender gap is substantially driven by class, race, and everything that comes with it. Economic precarity, neighborhood poverty, contact with the criminal justice system, and the specific vulnerabilities of boys in environments of concentrated disadvantage. And here's what's remarkable. None of that appears in the PragerU video, not once. Summers talks about boys throughout. Boys in America's schools, what boys need. But boys are not a monolith. The boys most affected by this gap are disproportionately Black and Latino boys from low-income households. The causes most closely associated with their outcomes, underfunded schools, racially biased discipline, family economic instability, are not mentioned at all. Who's the villain? Every argument has a villain, or at least a cause, and the choice of villain tells you almost everything about what a piece of rhetoric is actually doing. The evidence on boys' educational outcomes points towards structural causes, economic disadvantage, racial bias in discipline. The hollowing out of working class employment, the fact that boys as a group develop certain executive function skills later than girls and get penalized for it early. These causes are real and documentable. They're also, frankly, kind of depressing because they don't have an obvious enemy. You can't be mad at poverty in a satisfying way. PragerU chooses a different villain. Not poverty, not racial bias and discipline, not a labor market that has destroyed the industries working class boys used to grow into. The villain is a cultural shift. Schools have become feeling-centered, competition-free, sedentary. The video doesn't say the word feminism explicitly, but the framing carries the meaning without the label. There's a war. Boys are the victims, and the cultural values responsible are ones the audience will recognize as associated with feminist educational philosophy. That's what war on boys means. That's what it's selling. And once you've bought that framing, the solutions follow naturally. You don't need to think about funding inequity between school districts. You don't need to think about what mass incarceration does to Black fathers and what that does to Black male students. You just need to identify the right cultural enemy and feel good about noticing it. The proposals that come out of this, more recess, adventure books, bring back competition, aren't all bad. Some of them are fine, but they don't touch the structural drivers of the gap. They are rearranging furniture in a building whose foundations are cracked. The Pop-Tart. Again. Let's go back to the Pop-Tart and the sword-fighting drawing. Both of these things really happened. Both are genuinely absurd examples of zero-tolerance thinking gone wrong. I'm not disputing that, but notice what they are. They are two stories, two cases. And then the video says, in short, boys in America's schools are routinely punished for being active, competitive, and restless. Two cases. Here's the thing about anecdotes that make national news. They make national news because they are unusual. That's the selection mechanism. A story only goes viral because it's notable, which means using it as evidence of what's routine is not good methodology. It's like seeing a segment about a man who survived being struck by lightning 3 times and concluding that lightning survival is routine. If extreme school discipline for normal boy behavior were truly widespread and systematic, you'd expect to see it in the discipline data. And what the discipline data actually shows is a pattern organized by race and class, not by boyishness. The kids being suspended at the highest rates aren't mainly energetic white suburban boys. According to Department of Education data, Black students made up 15% of enrollment, but over 30% of suspensions and expulsions. Federal data confirms that Black boys are disproportionately targeted, even when controlling for behavior. The Pop-Tart story is doing a lot of work in this video. It's meant to feel like proof that something is routinely happening, but it's just a story, and stories aren't data. The boys this video isn't about. I want to be honest about something. The boys who are most disadvantaged in the American educational system, whose outcomes are worse, whose graduation rates are lowest, who are most exposed to harsh discipline, are not who this video was made for. The PragerU audience is not primarily low-income Black and Latino families. The video's framing, its rhetoric about feeling-centered classrooms and adventure books, is speaking to a different anxiety. The suburban, predominantly white, culturally conservative parent who worries that their son is being told his competitive instincts are symptoms of something toxic. That anxiety is real, by the way, and it's worth taking seriously. Research does suggest that boys in many school environments feel that academic engagement is coded as feminine. The studiousness is seen as uncool or insufficiently masculine by peers. That peer culture pressure is a genuine drag on boys' academic aspirations. Studies have documented this. A paper published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives found that educational aspirations, not behavior problems or test scores, were among the strongest predictors of the gender gap in college enrollment, and that gender identity concerns may lead boys to undervalue educational achievement. But, and this is the part that should be interesting to anyone who actually cares about the boys, one of the best supported causes of the educational gender gap is in feminist influence on schools. It's a particular construction of masculinity, specifically the cultural coding of academic achievement as feminine, which boys absorb from peers and from the broader culture, not from feeling-centered teachers. A video that actually wanted to help boys would have to grapple with that. It would have to ask, what does it mean that studiousness has been coded as unmanly in many peer cultures? How do you make educational ambition compatible with masculine identity? Those are genuinely hard questions. They don't have a clean villain. But there's something else that video would need to do. It would need to actually talk about Black and Latino male students, the students for whom the gap is largest and the consequences most severe. It would need to talk about what exclusionary discipline actually does to those boys. It would need to ask why the war on boys produces the most casualties in zip codes with the lowest property tax bases. That video wouldn't have a simple villain, but it might actually help some boys. A 7-year-old boy was sent home for nibbling a Pop-Tart into a gun. In 2017 to 2018, Black students made up 15% of public school enrollment, but over 30% of all suspensions and expulsions. Both of those sentences are true. PragerU chose to open with one of them. Here's the thing about the phrase war on boys. It's a useful phrase. There are conditions that make boyhood, and particularly disadvantaged boyhood, genuinely harder than it needs to be. But if you want to understand those conditions, you have to follow the data into the places where the data is the most uncomfortable. You have to look where the casualties actually are. What PragerU has done is take a real problem, strip it of its most important dimensions, race, class, the structural, dress it up as a culture war grievance, and sell it to an audience that will walk away feeling informed. And that audience will have learned almost nothing about the boys who need the most help. That, more than any feeling-centered classroom, is a war on boys worth worrying about.